Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 10th Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your organizer, host, chief cat herder for the next hour. Welcome, everybody. I'm very, very glad to see you and to hear you soon and to read you. Today, we're going to be spending the hour focusing on the economics of higher education. But first, a couple of introductions. Next slide, please. The Future Trends Forum comes out of a research project of mine called Future Trends in Technology and Education. It's a long-running trends analysis and horizon scan project. If you'd like to learn more about it, you can go to ftte.us and you'll see back issues of the report. You can subscribe and learn more. But we've been doing a monthly environmental scan for several years now, so we have a sense of what longitudinal forces are really important for trying to understand the future of education and technology. Next slide, please. And I want to thank NiserNet for their generous support. They've been big fans of FTTE and contributed greatly this year. We're very pleased for their support and thank them. Also to thank for their support is Shindig. Shindig is providing the technological platform that we're sitting in right now, a wonderful video conference tool. And they've also provided wonderful staff, some of whom are down there right now mingling, like Christopher and Zach and Jeffrey, who are just doing terrific technological support. And I thank them very much. Next slide. Now, before we introduce our guest, I want to say a couple of words about the Shindig environment that we're in right now. If you're new to it, or if you haven't been for a while, let me just recap. The very top half of the screen, you'll see two windows. I'm in one, and next to me is another. This is called the stage, and this is where speakers are, and this is where some materials are, like the slides you see here. And also, as we go, we can bring people up, and you can be on stage and ask questions and talk. Below is the swarm, that's what I think of it, of all participants. So everyone who is listening in, watching, typing, and reading, everyone gets represented by a box. It may be a video picture, maybe a static photo, but that's the horde, that's the audience, if you will. And you'll see as we go that swarm will move back and forth as people come, go, move around. And people can individually click on each other to have a conversation, and they can do that in total privacy. Now, I mentioned the chat box. So if you haven't typed in the chat box, it's right there, and already it's got people introducing themselves. But on the bottom right is another way to participate. You'll see two orange dots, one that has the word raise and a hand like this. If you click that, unsurprisingly, you'll be raising your hand. And that means that we and the Shindig staff get to hear, someone wants to speak, and then we can bring you up on stage. So if you've got your mic and your camera ready to go, click that if you want to say something or ask something. Next to that is a little orange ask button. So if your camera doesn't work, your mic doesn't work, or if you just don't want to be visible or audible, that's fine. Ask will give us a direct question. So you can type in a question and I can read that back so you can get your participation in the mix. Meanwhile, if you're a Twitter fan or a Twitter user, we are currently using the hashtag FTTE. And you'll see that there's already some discussion there. So those are 4 different channels for you to give feedback. Now, to get started, I want to welcome our guest, Professor Robert Archibald. He's a professor of economics at the College of William & Mary, and he's a specialist in the enormously important, very, very complex and challenging field of higher education economics. He co-authored a wonderful book that I strongly recommend called Why Does College Cost So Much? It also gets the best title of an Oxford University Press book, I think. And the book answers that question in great detail. Today, he and I will be discussing what's happening with higher education economics, everything from technology to labor to costs. So as we go, please keep in mind comments, observations, questions you have. After our first half of the hour, we're going to break into small groups and we will discuss with each other. So if you want to have more questions, you can save them for then. But otherwise, we'd love to hear from you. So now, Shindig staff, if you could please bring Bob up on stage. Welcome, Bob.
Nice to be here, or there.
Excellent. Great to see you. I'm really glad. or wherever cyberspace is, right? Which is a classic problem. It's really good to see you. I'm very glad you're able to make the time to discuss with us today about these very, very important subjects. Just to begin with, I have a doozy of a question, which is, if I can ask, right now in 2016, what are the big drivers of change in higher education economics?
Well, there are several. I think the first is probably the continuing disinvestment in higher education by state governments. In just about every state, the amount of state appropriation per student is declining, and that's putting state-supported institutions in a real bind. They've got to replace that revenue or reduce costs somehow. So that's a big stressor in the state-supported schools. And you see, I think the worst case right now is Illinois, where there's no state budget, and so schools haven't received any appropriations, and that's creating havoc. But there are lots of other states where significant cuts to the amount of appropriations given to state institutions are causing institutions a lot of difficulty. So that's one that affects one sector,
One big one.
in higher education. I think the next one, one that I'd like to illustrate with one of the slides that I sent, the slide toward the bottom of the deck.
Pulling them up now.
The income distribution in the U.S., real household income. Is there a way that we can get that so people can see it?
Coming right up. Hang on one sec. And while they pull all the levers to make that happen, can you introduce that that data? This is your second point, disinvestment by states.
Yeah. Well, everyone knows about the sort of top 1% getting most of the income gains, and the data I'm going to show you are household income in the U.S. by fifths of the income distribution for 1967 to 2010. And it's easier to talk about it if people can see it.
Yeah, that's coming right up. Although just to make you feel even better, Bob, just as a personal note, I was born in 1967, so this is like a very personal graph for me. Well, actually, why don't we come back to that in a sec, so we can make sure that the chart comes up. Why don't we return to that? You can move to your third point, and then we can come back to the second one.
I was all ready with my second point. So, well, the other thing that is, I think, a big challenge is really more about perception than reality. There is, in many people's view, this idea that a college education doesn't pay off anymore, and that students are leaving college with mountains of debt that they're going to have a hard time overcoming, and that this is going to eventually cause people to flee from even attempting college. And I think that's not the reality, but it's the perception. And so the reality is that the average amount of debt that college college students come out of college with is manageable for the vast majority of students, but it's very popular to pick out the sort of highly indebted student and write your newspaper story based on looking at that. And it's the power of an anecdote over data. Data about the average, which is important to know about, just doesn't have the power that the anecdote does. And so lots of people know somebody who moved back in with their parents and has this huge debt, but those are very unrepresentative cases. And
right.
The rate of return to a college education is better than just about any investment you can think of. But people don't.
What are the current stats about this? Last I saw, I thought that 2/3 of students ended up with debt, and of those that had debt, the average amount was about $29,000. Is that right?
That's right, but that includes the for-profit sector, in which the average debt is quite a bit higher. If you go to a traditional state-supported or private school, the average is closer to 26, I think, or 25. The for-profit sector does generate students with more debt.
So we have the for-profit sector, especially generating debt, followed by the private sector, followed by the public.
I think that's right.
What causes this perception to be so bad? Is it mostly just the media stories?
I think it's media stories. As I said, the anecdotes trump data most of in terms of the way they affect people's perceptions, and the newspapers have presented those powerful anecdotes of somebody you've got to feel very sorry for, but they're just not representative of the norm.
Understood. Let me walk you back, if I could, just to the first point, because each of these are very, very powerful and require some, I think, more unpacking. The disinvestment by states, as you said, on a per capita basis, or sorry, on a per student basis, because the total amount of spending by a state may go up, but that's because, in part, the total amount of students is being expanding rapidly. Do you find, what are the main reasons for the states to decrease that per student funding? Is it based on competition with other services such as Medicare, Medicaid, or the penal system? Or is there an ideology at work, or why is this happening?
There's two factors. One of, I should have said this earlier, but all the work I've done on the economics of higher education has all been joint work with my colleague David Feldman, who co-authored the book, and David gets a lot of credit for everything, I think. But one of the earliest papers we wrote early in our collaboration on the economics of higher education was about the effect of the tax revolt on appropriations to colleges and universities. And in an awful lot of states, there are provisions that limit spending. And after those provisions were enacted, spending on higher education went down. So it's partly ideological, just the conservative movement saying the government is the problem, and we should cut state spending, and we should not ever raise taxes. And so part of it is just reduction in the size of the public sector in states. And the second part of it is, as you suggested, competition from Medicaid and from prisons and from K-12 education, which is a more powerful lobby than higher education in many states. So it's both a reduction in overall state spending and a shift in state spending.
So in a sense, and this is already happening in Illinois, there's a kind of competition, or it can play as a competition between higher ed and K-12.
Yep, that could be part of the story. And there are more kids in K-12 than there are in college. Therefore, more parents.
That's a pretty fierce argument. Yes, more taxpayers, yes. Michael Berman has a really, really good question. He asks, it seems that the discussion of the value of higher ed has moved from a social good to a private good. Any comments?
Well, I think that's right. I think that partly it is the sort of tone of political rhetoric in the U.S. now, which is shifted in the same direction. But it's also partly it's a shift in who's paying for the education. In earlier times, the government was the majority payer, and now parents and students are the majority payers. And I think that affects the way people talk about the value of higher education now.
So it used to be that the state was the majority payer, but now the parents and students, the families, are the majority payers. That's a huge shift.
That I have. Part of the slides we can't get up demonstrates that.
Well, we have one more question here.
Sure.
And then we'll try the slides one more time. I never give up. Mark Ulett says, I would appreciate if Robert could speak to the relationship between declining enrollment and increasing prices in the past decade. Are they related? Good question, Mark.
Well, you're asking an economist if the demand curve is downward sloping. Is that?
That's a good way to try. Can you explain that? Explain that.
Well, to my knowledge, there's very little evidence of declining enrollment. In fact, I think it's just the last couple of years that aggregate enrollment has not grown. So
it's gone down.
It's a long time period when prices were rising as well as enrollments. And I'm not sure entirely if I'm going to pin the last couple, any arguments I want to make on the last couple of years. So I don't think there's good evidence that the overall enrollment is going down. And in fact, I'm not even sure, or I'm quite sure, that the average price net of, when you net out all the financial aid, the average price of a not-for-profit four-year school has actually declined in the last 10 years. And it's gone up at state-supported institutions, but not nearly as much as the list price. So when you factor in all of the grants and scholarships and so on that students get, price has not gone up that much.
That's the actual, not the sticker price, but the actual price net financial aid. What's, just as a quick question for myself, for you, what's the best data source for finding average net price for higher ed?
The College Board publishes something called Trends in College Prices, and that's the go-to source for that kind of data.
Thanks.
and it's available on the web for nothing. And even you can get all of the tables. You can get all the Excel files behind all the tables.
We're going to try that population and income slide right now. See if we can get this to work.
Okay, that's one of them. Yep. Okay, let's stop. Can we pause there? So this is the slide that demonstrates sort of what's happened to who pays the bill. And the red line on top is state government. The middle line is families and students. And the bottom line is the federal government. And what this demonstrates is it used to be that state governments paid a large share, and they have bailed out. The federal government share is fairly constant until quite recent increases in Pell Grants increased the federal, but the share paid for by families has been increasing for quite some time. Okay, can we page through the slides again? This is, all right, pause on this one. So this is the income distribution slide I was talking about. The bottom blue line is the real income that is corrected for inflation of families at the 20th percentile of the income distribution, and it has been flat for the entire 67 to 2010 time period. The red one, next one up, is the income, the family at the 40th percentile of the income distribution, and they've gotten tiny gains. The 60th percentile, the green line, shows some increase. The 80th percentile, the purple line, has considerable increases. Then we have the 95th percentile. We don't have the 99th percentile because our graph wouldn't go that high. But what this demonstrates is a fanning out of the income distribution. It's gotten wider. The starting period in the 60s was when probably the income distribution was as compact as it ever was historically, but it's fanning back out. It's fanning out, and this makes things difficult for colleges that would like to have an economically diverse student body. The way you do that is you charge more to people in the 80th percentile and 95th percentile than you do students from the 20th and 40th. And that kind of income distribution through selectively discounting tuition worked pretty well when incomes of the high income people were growing. But if you look sort of starting in about 2000, the income growth stopped for the 80th percentile, and it stopped for the 95th percentile of the income distribution. And so a system based on increasing the prices for the people with the ability to pay so you can keep them low for the people, the students that come from families whose income is not growing, ceased being a very as workable a proposition. And people at the 95th percentile, the top 5% of the income, have had a flat income. It's only growing at the parts of the income distribution above that, the top 1%, and so on. And this puts real pressure on colleges, because to make a system in which you are increasing prices, but only the high income people are actually paying that high list price, those people are starting to complain. And so this shift so that the income gains are only at the tip top of the income distribution has made it much harder for colleges to continue to price discriminate the way they have been.
I'll step aside. Thank you very much, both for those detailed answers, but also for those crystalline charts, which I think really describe several changes in perfect visualizations. I have some questions myself. I'd like to follow up on these, but I think we have some more from the audience. Christopher, do you want to bring up a couple of these questions? People seem to prefer to ask them. One is Michael Berman again. He says, I'd be interested in his analysis of the difference between the price of college, generally what families pay, so I think he means net price, versus cost to educate.
Okay, well that's a really important point. Most people who think about the terms cost and price have in mind their Econ 101 discussion about a business firm, and a business firm has the cost of producing the item, and then there's the price, and the difference between the price and the cost is the profit margin. And on the main and on the whole, if you're thinking about what's causing prices to go up, it is usually because costs of producing are going up, because profit margins are kept in check by competition for the most part. Higher education for nonprofit organizations like state-supported colleges and the nonprofit sector in higher education are subsidized, either by state appropriations or by endowment earnings and gifts, and sometimes all three. So that the formula that works for higher education is price is equal to cost minus subsidy. So the cost of producing the education is typically more than the price because of the subsidy. In cases of state appropriations, sometimes states will fund as much as half of the cost of providing the education, and for well-endowed institutions, the earnings from the endowment can cover a large fraction of the cost of providing the education. So when you're looking at what's causing price to go up in higher education, what's driving tuition, it can be costs, but it can also be reductions in subsidies. And that's the case for state-supported colleges and universities. One of the major reasons why the price they're charging is going up is the subsidies they're receiving from state appropriations are going down.
So, for example, University of California, Berkeley's decision to get rid of 6% of support staff, and I think that's just the beginning, by the way, is largely driven by their massive deficit, and that is in turn caused by decline in the subsidy, which in their case is from the state of California.
That's part of it, although I think it also points to not being very clever at forecasting on the part of the Cal Berkeley people, because they sort of expanded beyond what they could afford, and you do that when you have overly rosy forecasts of what your revenues are going to be. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure in Berkeley's case this is the harbinger of things to come, because Berkeley can, if allowed to, could earn a whole lot more tuition revenue than they currently own. I mean, they have a very selective school with tons of applications and students who are used to paying a very low price, but many of them could afford quite a bit more.
Now, I mean, speaking of subsidies, there's also the state of California, which is putting a cap on the number of students they can recruit from out of state.
Yeah.
Because out-of-state students have to pay a great deal more. But Michael, if you want to add more to that, please bring up in the chat box, because I know you are, in all seriousness, very knowledgeable and very concerned about California. We have another question here from Ray. Ray wants to know, when colleges raise prices for wealthiest to keep net cost low for most, it seems like colleges need a framing or a PR overhaul in regards to cost. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, a lot of colleges are pretty clever at framing this, because they don't tend to talk about exactly where the funds come from that allow them to give a lot of students scholarships. And they're very clever about, in many cases, giving fancy names to those scholarships. And so if there's many parents think that the reason their student is not paying full price is that they're a special student and has a scholarship. And not very many schools are very upfront about the fact that what they're doing is charging different net prices to students based in part on need. So I think if they were upfront about what they'd have a much bigger PR problem, but they're pretty savvy about making it look like they're just rewarding students. Everyone wants to have a child who gets a scholarship, right? And if what it is just charging different prices to different students, but if you have a list price and then people get scholarships, that sells. And there are schools that give every freshman a scholarship.
Wow. Everyone gets a trophy.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a great question, Ray. And Bob, I'm really glad to hear you bring up an even worse PR nightmare. That sounds like a kind of grim future. We've one more question from Vanessa Vale. Vanessa asks, what is the distribution of costs across different kinds of institutions, i.e. community colleges versus universities? Thank you, Vanessa.
There's a huge distribution. There's a very good article written, I think, I'm not going to remember when, by Gordon Winston, who taught at Williams College and did a lot of really good research on higher education costs. And he had data that showed for four-year schools, average cost at the highest 10% of the schools was, I think, not quite, about 6 times as much as it was the lowest 10% of the schools. So cost per student went up through the whole distribution by a factor of about 6. And he did not include community colleges. And the costs of providing what happens at community colleges is a lot lower. Now, but that's not quite an apples to apples comparison, because four-year schools produce research and two-year schools don't. And, and you have to be careful, and splitting out the research cost is really hard to do. So the data you have are for total cost.
Right. Well, especially a liberal arts institution, or I mean at William & Mary, where faculty have that mixture of research and teaching responsibilities.
Yeah.
This is thank you, Vanessa. That's a great question, and this really opens things wide. Let me ask if we could quickly change gears, and I'd like to ask everybody here if you could consider these drivers that Professor Archibald has just laid out. So again, these are the disinvestment by states on a per student basis. This is the transformation of household income, number 2, which is the fanning out of income inequality. And the third is this perception of price and debt being far worse than reality. I was wondering if you could take a minute and talk to each other and see how you see these drivers playing out. Which of these seems most important to you? Which of these do you see as most salient? So we'll just take a couple of minutes. Bob and I will pop off the stage and grab onto you guys. So if you don't have your mics turned on, turn them on so we can chat. Okay, shindig guys, pull us off. Well, welcome back, friends. If we were in a face-to-face environment, if we were in a big seminar room, or if we were at a restaurant or a lecture hall, in my mind's eye or in my ear, I imagine that the minute Bob and I hopped off the stage, there was a buzz, a roar of conversation. People had so many comments and questions, and we've seen a little bit of that on Twitter. Let me ask, if you guys, did you have any questions or observations that came out of that discussion that you'd like to bring up? Please either click the raise hand or the ask button, or put something in the chat, because I was very impressed by the conversations that I saw. And Bob, on Twitter, there's been a lot of people basically repeating what you said with appreciation. People were summarizing your higher ed cost equals price, my subsidy, talking about the social good and private benefit range. So if we get any more specific questions out of that, I'll bring them up. So here's one question that comes from the excellent Peter Hess. He says, why is my experience so different from the norm? My kid completed UMass as a Mass resident, and even with us paying thousands a year, her debt was more than $60,000. Thank you for coming forward, Peter.
Well, that's a difficult question, because as state residents in and this is for 4 years of college, so she borrowed on average 15.
I think so.
That's well above the norm. Partly tuition is dramatically different across states, and tuition at state-supported institutions in the Northeast is well above the national average. I think New Hampshire and Vermont have the highest in-state tuition for on average, and I'm sure Massachusetts is not very far away. So that's part of it. It's just it's state policy that doesn't support its state institutions very much.
Yeah, that's you'll appreciate this. I just got into an argument with a state legislator about that. I live in Vermont, and I was asking, why are we so bad at supporting public education? And the legislator said, because public education advocates badly for itself. Wow. Okay, that's one answer. Well, let me, while people are burning out their own questions, I wanted to shift focus to a different aspect of economics and higher ed. Um, what is the impact of technology going to be right now? Say in the next 5 years. And we've got technology all over the place, from course management systems to mobile devices to video conferencing. I mean, how is that changing the economics of higher ed?
Well, this is not the economics of higher ed, but one thing that's really interesting, I've taught for 40 years, and I used to come into a classroom and there was a buzz of students talking, and you'd have to quiet them down. Now I come into a classroom, it's dead silent, and they're all on their mobile devices, checking their email or looking at Facebook or whatever they're doing. So that part has changed pretty dramatically.
Yes.
I mean, this is another case where I'd really like to get one of those slides up if that's possible. There we are. Oh, I hope people can see that. Oh, good. Okay. One of the things Professor Feldman and I did for a book we're currently writing about the future of higher education is took a look at what students who are drawn to online degree programs and versus on campus. So we got data from Arizona State, Penn State, and Southern New Hampshire. And all three run on-campus programs and online programs. And the students who are drawn to online are quite different from the students who are drawn to on-campus programs. If you look at Arizona State, the online students are 10 years on average older than the on-campus students. And it's a little bit larger at Penn State, and it's just 10 years so the third column of numbers is the average age. And the other thing about people who are drawn to online programs is that they've already tried college. The bottom two lines are showing about people who began the program with lots of credits. And the online students tend to be people who've tried college at one point. They have accumulated some credits, but then life got in the way, and after a while, they want to go back and complete a degree, and they've got a job and a family and other responsibilities, and they can't go full time and sort of commit the 2 or 3 years that they have left in their educational career. And so online courses that can be done asynchronously, worked around the family and the job, are really appealing. But they haven't cracked the traditional age college model very much at all. And I think that's because the bundle of things that is a college experience is very appealing to people right out of high school. And so there's part of the market that online programs are doing fairly well in, but if you look at the traditional on-campus models, technology is not replacing face-to-face teaching, it's augmenting it. It's making it better. I can reach my students with blast emails, instantly, and I can. There's all kinds of ways in which technology is enhancing what goes on campus, but for the most part, it's not a matter of replacement. So online total programs like the Arizona State Online or Penn State Online or what Southern New Hampshire does with their all online degrees appeals to an almost entirely separate audience.
I feel like if I were on stage, I'm like being pushed on. That's extremely powerful research, Professor Archibald. I mean, that reveals a great deal about the transformation of higher education. I wonder, if you think back, say, to 1955, maybe, where a lot of higher education in the U.S. was traditional age undergraduate. Maybe we're returning to that, and the adult learners will tend to be online.
Well, the 1955 and thereabouts is when everyone thought educational TV was going to take over.
Oh yes, oh yes.
And
you can go back 50 years before that with Edison saying we won't use textbooks anymore. We'll just be using movies.
Yeah.
Let me ask. We're coming up on the end of the hour. We have about 5 minutes left. So let me first ask if anybody in the audience has any more questions they want to ask. I've got about 10 I have to ask, but please throw them in the chat box or put your hand up or hit the ask button. While you're thinking about that, let me ask, if I could, about one other aspect to the economics of higher ed, which is a labor question. Historically, we've seen this big transformation where the proportion of faculty who are tenure track or tenured has declined, and the proportion of faculty who are actually not tenure track has increased. And this is partly under the header of adjunctification, because adjuncts are increasingly numerous, but we also see the rise of full-time yet non-tenure track faculty. Is that having an impact on college economics, and how is that going to change things?
Well, if your revenue base is eroding, as it is at many state institutions and at some private institutions, and you're primarily a wage payer. I mean, 80% of the costs at most colleges are for the workers. And the highest priced workers are the professors, although unfortunately not always. But if you have to cut costs, that's one place you can do it. You can move from tenure track to non-tenure track faculty, and you can add adjuncts. And in many cases, that's been forced on colleges. When a retirement occurs and they think about hiring another tenure track faculty or hiring 3 or 4 adjuncts, sometimes the brute force economics of it suggests that hiring 3 or 4 adjuncts is a much better way to go. I think that impoverishes the education, primarily, not so necessarily in the classroom, but the sort of outside of the classroom part of professor office hours and students coming in for advice. The adjuncts aren't around to do that kind of thing, and I think unfortunately, in some cases, when budgets get tight, the quality of the education suffers, and there are lots of wonderful adjuncts. I don't want to say that they do a bad job, but they can't quite do the whole job.
I think you were very precise in your words. You said it's an impoverishment, not of the classroom, but outside of that.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a grim, but I think extremely useful answer. We have time for one last question, and this comes from Sam Anderson, who asks, are disruptive education industries or interests driving this high debt cost narrative through political lobbying? So he's going back to your point 3 about the gap between the tuition and actual price.
I think the most powerful political lobby in higher education now seems to me to be the for-profit institutions, many of them who rely considerably on technology, the sort of University of Phoenix online kinds of places, and there are quite a few of them. And the data on debt by type of institution is pretty clear that you are come out with much higher debt from that kind of a school. Also, the data on the sort of percentage of the revenues that come from either loans or grants from the federal government show that those kinds of institutions are very good at coaching their students about the availability of that kind of aid. And sometimes, there's a rule that you have to have at least 10% not from federal sources. And some of those schools are really close to violating that rule. So to the extent that they're effective lobbyists, and I think they're very effective lobbyists, the question is on to something.
Well, thank you. I think that's I think the lobbyists for the for-profits are losing, given the series of recent federal decisions against them. But I hate to pause this, but we're out of time. It's 3 o'clock here in EST, and Bob, I have to thank you for an incredibly generous hour. You have given us so much.
This is a very quick hour. The time went fast.
Well, it's far too quick for me too. I'm very greedy and would have liked more. I need to bump you off the stage for a sec because I need to put up some slides for next week if I could. But let me thank you so much for your terrific outcome. We have, I don't want to keep you guys too far past the hour. We'll just say that next Tuesday, we've got we shift ground again to focus a bit more on technology. Our guest will be the incredibly photogenic Cable Green, who's the Director of Open Education for the Creative Commons. And we'll be talking about open education and the role the Creative Commons movement has. So you can follow him on Twitter. He's very active there, and learn a lot more at creativecommons.org. In the chat box, let me just add one more thing. This is a PDF of a paper that Professor Archibald co-authored with his frequent collaborator, Professor Feldman, about federal financial aid policy. We touched on that at the very end. It addresses a classic problem in higher education finance. So take a look at that when you can. We have a recording for this session. I'll put this up along with my notes on my blog and on YouTube. In the meantime, let me thank you all very, very much for your time. I really appreciate your questions and your contributions. I'll be here for a few more minutes if you'd like to chat, but otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thanks again. And thank you, Shindig, for all your support in making this happen. Thank you.